My name is Lauren Wozniak, and I am the Program Director at Willow House. I'm pleased to introduce to you our new series, Living with Grief in Uncertain Times, Help and Support for Families. This new series is facilitated by Willow House's senior trainers, Pamela and Andy McNeil. This will be a 5-part series released weekly online. At the 6th week of our series, we will have a live Q&A session with Andy, Pamela, and myself. Please bring any questions and thoughts that you might want to share. We're looking forward to supporting you virtually at this time.
Hi, this is Andy McNeil here with Pamela Gabay. We're glad to be here and have a discussion with you again in our series, Living with Grief in Uncertain Times, Help and Support for Families. During this discussion, we're going to spend some time talking about navigating grief during COVID-19 and how to help yourself as the parent or caregiver. As we get started, we wanted to just acknowledge a couple of things that we think are important in this discussion. By parent or caregiver, Pamela and I acknowledge that there are a lot of different roles that people might play in the lives of children. We recognize that you might be in the situation where you're a grandparent and you're raising your grandchildren who are grieving. Or maybe you're an aunt or an uncle who has taken a niece or a nephew into your home and you're raising your niece and nephew who's bereaved or grieving. Or perhaps you're a foster parent who's caring for a child who's grieving. So we just want to acknowledge that we're going to use the terms caregiver, parent, fairly interchangeable during this conversation. And by that, we acknowledge that it could be any of these particular relationships that you're having. But what you all have in common, I would think, who are listening in on this discussion, is that you are actively raising a child or a teenager who is bereaved or grieving. So we wanted to acknowledge that up front as well. The other thing we wanted to take just a minute to acknowledge is why we are having this discussion on taking care of yourself before we have the discussion on how to help your child. So many times in my life, time that I've spent with parents and children who are grieving, the parent would often say to me, I need you to help my child. How can I help my child? If my child's okay, I'll be okay. And one of the things that I would remind parents is that while I understand that if your kids are okay, then you're okay in a lot of ways. But it's also true the opposite way, that if you're okay, it's more likely that your kids will be okay. And so we really are starting by talking about taking care of yourself, because in a lot of ways, that's the first step to taking care of your children. And now, Pamela, did you have anything that you wanted to add to either of those?
Yes, thank you, Andy. I agree with that completely. And, just one of the things that we found in our field with all kinds of research for many years is that children do best when their parents and guardians are coping. And children do best when they see how their parents and guardians are reacting to things and how they're taking care of themselves. And that's why it's so important that we bring this up in the beginning, and why we do start with talking about how they're doing, how the parents are doing, you as a caregiver, how are you doing in your grief and coping with everything going on around you.
Right. And so we will talk some more. Our next conversation will be about taking care of your children. But this really is a first step in that. And so for the next 20, 25 minutes, we're just going to have a discussion about what that means to take care of yourself. Let's talk a little bit about the environment that we're doing that. We might be doing that in, right? We have to acknowledge that we're all in a strange time. I don't know how else to say it in our world with COVID-19 and the challenges that brings to all of us, but very particular to you, to me, the living with this sense of uncertainty, being isolated in our homes, our kids aren't able to attend school, so they're home all day. Some of us are having to become teachers as well as parents. Maybe we've lost our job or our job is on furlough until things change. Maybe we're now working from home because we can, and so we're learning technology, all of those things that are part of that. So we wanted to start here and talk a little bit about just the state of the world right now and how that's impacting us and even impacting our ability to care for ourselves. Pamela, did you have anything just on this topic?
Yeah, when you think about the world we're in right now, I talk about it being really an upside down world, because what we could depend on and count on in the past, we really can't depend upon now, because everything is so different and everything has changed. And, one of the things I think about is in these times of uncertainty and in these times of not knowing what might happen next, how is that not only impacting our grief, but how is that impacting our ability to parent? How is that impacting our ability to reassure our children? And, one of the recommendations that I would make for parents is it's okay to say, I don't have the answers either, or I'm not sure either, but we are going to get through this together. And that I'm just talking specifically right now about COVID-19 and how the world isn't predictable right now. One of the things that's reassuring to children and in terms of even taking care of themselves is to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. And to not part of caring for yourself is to not put so much pressure on yourself to have all the answers.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So often, some of our stress during this time comes from not being able to be patient with ourselves and our own limitations. Yeah. Even when it comes to what we know and what we don't know. And that statement that you said is so powerful, and it's powerful for a child to hear you say, I don't have all the answers, but we're going to get through this together. That's certainly, I think, a key part of that. That second part, if you don't have the answers, that's fine. Acknowledge you don't have the answers, but it is important to obviously reassure that whatever, we're going to do this together. It's part of that.
Right. And part of taking the pressure off of yourself in some aspect is by saying you're doing the best that you can.
Yeah.
And that is something that parents often don't do. They don't, sort of pat themselves on the back and say, I am doing the best that I can, right, given what I know. And right now, there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't have to be perfect as a parent. There's not a lot of perfect answers. So I love that. Cut yourself some slack.
Exactly.
To begin with. So, but not only is there COVID-19, we also want to acknowledge that we're talking about how do we care for ourselves in the midst of that COVID-19. And I think there's a number of things. We could certainly maybe watch less news.
Yes.
We want to keep up. It's important that you have knowledge and know what's happening and where we are as a community and as a nation and as a world when it comes to the pandemic. But we also have to give ourselves some breaks from that, take some time away and aside from those things. And, there's one thing where people will sometimes just distract themselves to the point where they're not keeping up with anything, or trying to just internalize their stress by just trying to stay busy. That's different. That's one thing that we might do. And sometimes that can be unhealthy. But it can be healthy at times to find things that distract us from all of the stress that might be going on around us. And I don't know what that is for you. I mean, all of us have different things. It could be music, just taking the time to listen to some music, or it could be taking the time to just have a quiet moment, or to read a book, or to go for a walk, or whatever it is. It's finding those things that enable you to, for lack of a better way to put it, to take a break from the reality of the pandemic, that 24 hours could be right in front of you if you're sitting in front of the TV and just soaking it in every minute of the day. That can be unhealthy for us.
You know, and one of the things I've started doing, Andy, is I will take at least one day out of the week, and it's typically the weekend, where I do truly unplug. And I might have my phone with me to take photos, but my phone is not, I'm not engaging with email. I'm not engaging with work. I'm not doing any of that. I'm unplugging from the news, from, like I said, technology and email, because the other thing that happens is if you are working from home, and I must say that I've noticed myself doing this, I tend to be on 24 hours a day because I'm working from home. And one of my friends said this to me the other day. She said, I'm used to being in an office, and I know that I don't have to prove I'm working, but there's something that's happening where you feel like it's almost like an unconscious thing that happens where you are constantly checking in with your email to prove that you're working because you're working from home, right? And that's one of those things that can backfire. And it's okay to say to everybody that you're going to take a mental break from the phone and the email, technology, and the news. Yeah. And it's a day of doing something like you mentioned, music, or, being outdoors. I always think about it this way too. Even before the person in your life or the people in your life died, even before that, what were some things that made you feel good or made you, happy or recharged your batteries? Yeah. What are those things? Because those are often the things that we find when we go back to in some capacity, they still have that effect on us. Right.
I agree. And I want to acknowledge it's difficult to unplug. If we are used to being on 24/7. I actually had a parent years ago say to me, "You don't understand. I can't walk away from my phone, my computer, whatever it may be. I've got work. I've got this." And what I remarked back to them is, if you don't make it a priority, it won't be. Mm-hmm. And you have to establish that at some point. And though it may be hard to establish, once you do, you're going to be grateful for that day that you have set aside, and you'll look forward to that day on a weekly basis. And I even said to this one particular parent who came back and said, "But you don't understand, if I do that, the whole day will be thinking there's emails piling up." Mm-hmm. So my suggestion to them was this: if that's the case, even if it's a weekend, put on your auto reply on your email and say something in it other than, I'm out of the office, leave a message, or go ahead and say, I am enjoying time away from work. I will get back to you on whatever date. And so in your mind, that people are being responded to and acknowledged, and that can help with maybe stress that you have over that. And I know we've taken a lot of time just to even talk about this, but to me, this is a central piece to how we care for ourselves, is to indeed unplug from all of the messages we're constantly getting about the pandemic and COVID that continue to add to our stress. I'm not saying pretend like these things aren't happening, because they are. But give ourselves breaks from those things. And so again, there's not only the COVID that we're dealing with, but many of you who are watching this, maybe you're watching because you had someone die prior to all of COVID, and you were already bereaved and you were already grieving that death. And then COVID happened. And so, there's this complication in some ways of our grief that we're already experiencing. Or maybe we have COVID that's happened, and since all of this event, you've had someone in your life die. Maybe of COVID, but maybe even not of COVID, and all of the challenges that are part of that, with being able to have a funeral and have people attend the funeral together and face to face, the way we do that ritual now, shifting a little bit. Or maybe they were in the hospital and you weren't able to be there with them. And so COVID not only is happening, but it had a direct impact on the experience that you went through when your person died. So we want to acknowledge that there's all sorts of situations that you could be in viewing this discussion. So we wanted to talk for a moment about some of those things and the impact that has on our lives. And so let's start with, if you've had a death prior to COVID and then COVID happens. And grief, we spoke about this in our last discussion, and that is that grief is not just a nice neat set of stages, but there is a sense of progression that can happen in our grief. And we might have found ourselves at a certain place in our grief, and then COVID happens. And I think there are sometimes thoughts that the events get all enmeshed in each other, and there may be some truth in that, but they're also separate events that are happening, and they sometimes can interfere with each other.
And
in
Andy,
that process.
if I could speak to that, recently I had a mom tell me that when COVID and the pandemic first started, she was grieving, and all of a sudden, everyone was talking about COVID. And when people were asking her how she was doing, they were talking about COVID. They weren't talking about her loss. And for her, that felt like almost like a second loss, because that support that she had been getting from everybody, both in person and, emotionally, everybody's attention shifted to worrying about COVID-19 and worrying about, their own safety. So that happened. And then she also just commented on not being able to be with her family. Here she's grieving and she can't be with her own parents because to be with them and see them could, obviously impact their health. Yeah. So she's missing a lot of support, both emotionally and physically. And, how do we cope with that? How do we take care of ourselves with this new reality?
Yeah, when the people who we would ordinarily be our support, which one way we take care of ourselves is finding those people who we can trust. And if we want to talk about it, we could talk about it and not be judged. And if those people, you're separated from them, the challenge that brings. I do want to stay with this for a second, though, because I think it's important. And by this, I mean, one of the ways we take care of ourselves is identifying a community, identifying people who get it. It could be, obviously attending a support group. Well, a lot of those aren't happening in person. Where do we go to make connections with people who get it? But then also our own supports and how important that is to reach out to people. And the reason I want to stay with this just for a second is because this can be a challenge. I've had so many bereaved people who I've spoken with and me myself, I've experienced this, where when you have a loss, sometimes the very people who would be your support end up not being your support, maybe not even because of something like COVID or not being able to get to them, but it could be the way they respond to you.
Yeah.
That they may say things they don't mean to be hurtful, but they may say things that are hurtful that turn you off of that relationship because sometimes people just don't know what to say. And so I think part of coping is certainly coping what we're talking about, coping with not being able to have access to those people, but it could be coping with the recognition that the people who you thought would be your support system maybe aren't your support system. And how do you cope with that?
And, that's something we hear a lot, isn't it? The people that I thought would be there for me aren't. And then these other people showed up. Right. And it could be, a friend from work. It could be a different family member. It could be a neighbor. And right now, they're probably not showing up in person, but showing up via phone calls or text messages, or, maybe they're asking if you want to FaceTime or get on Zoom. But it is often surprising who does show up. And we can't always count on the people that we thought would, be there. And, the other thing too, Andy, is that often with taking care of ourselves when we're grieving, it's important that we have a break from our children to take care of ourselves. And in the middle of COVID in this new era, we can't actually have people babysitting our children, whether those are outside babysitters or family members, right? So we don't have that same built-in support system that we're accustomed to having. And, that's another challenge. Right?
Yeah, very much so. So I wonder if we could shift our conversation a little bit and let's talk about coping. Like, what does that look like? What are some ideas for coping? And I think we've already hit a couple of them. And I'll just reiterate, one of the things we can do to help ourselves in our grief is by finding those people who will be your people, that you can depend on and go to, who will listen, who won't judge, and be prepared that it may not be the people you think it will be. I mean, it could be those people, but it may not be. And so part of what I would say, a first step is identifying some of those people, but also allowing new people into your life who might be those people, only because maybe they've gone through it as well. And so they may not have been a really close friend in the past. They're going to get you on a level that other people don't. And so giving yourself permission to have that. And then the second thing I think we already mentioned is, how can you, even though it's challenging, how can you creatively think through, how do I create some space for myself where my kids are not always there? How do I do that? Because the reality is, let's just be frank. I'm a parent. Pamela's a parent. We need breaks from our children as much as they need breaks from us. And we'll get to that in our next, video. But we need breaks from our children. And how do we plan for that? What does that look like? And it may be challenging. There may be different challenges depending on the age of our children, right? If you have an infant, it's a little different scenario. If you have a toddler that can get around, needs that constant supervision, we get it. So we want to acknowledge we get that. Yeah. It doesn't change the fact that if we can do some creative thinking about how do we create that space for ourselves, because there's 100 excuses of how we can't, and thinking through that. So those are the first two things I think that we're putting out there as ways to cope: finding space for yourself, finding your people who can listen and care and get you on a level others don't.
Absolutely, Andy. And again, I know that we're stressing this. If you don't carve out that time for yourself, no one else is going to do it for you. And it might not be practical that it's during the day when your kids are awake. We acknowledge that. Everybody has different circumstances. But if you're able to encourage them to go and do something on their own, and you're over here doing something on your own, we were talking about that before, Andy, before this recording, that's important. If that's not possible, maybe like you said, they're a toddler or an infant, then try getting up before the kids get up, or stay up just a little bit after they go to bed, to have some time for yourself. And again, whatever that looks like for you. And even within families, the adults could all be coping differently and often are. And also, the adults find different things that help them. So it really is what helps you that's most important.
Oh yeah, and there maybe if there's people in your life, neighbors or really good friends, who you never really isolated yourself from during this time, but you all sort of isolated together in that regard. One of the things that I've seen people struggle with over the years is just accepting help from others. Yeah. I mean, how many people say to us in our grief or even during difficult times, let me know what I can do to help.
Right.
And it's hard. I admit for some of us, I'm one of those people. It's hard to reach out and say, okay, yeah, I do need some help. And this is the help that I need. I know we're social distancing and we need to do that. We need to follow the guidelines so that we're all safe and that we get through this pandemic. At the same time, there may be people in your life who, again, you've maintained a close relationship with, just to have those people in your life. Ask yourself how you can use those relationships to help you in this particular situation as well. Another thing, thinking about self-care, there are other things we can do besides finding those people who are our people by finding space for ourselves. Some of it is just some basic things we do to take care of ourselves in life. When we're stressed out and we're going through a difficult time, it can be challenging to eat a healthy diet, for example. Thinking about what we're putting into our bodies. Maybe that's a different way to look at it. I know we say eating a healthy diet, but thinking about what things am I putting into my body and what do those things do for my body? It reminds me of when I was a kid, we had Saturday morning cartoons and I'll get up and we wanted to watch Saturday morning cartoons. And one of the shorts that they did between cartoons was talking about your body. And I remember the phrase, you are what you eat. I mean, it was every Saturday morning, it would say, you are what you eat. And it was like this person eating all this junky stuff and it turned them into whatever it turned them into, right? And then people eating healthy things and they're in a healthier situation. That has never changed. There's certainly been lots of research over the last 100 years on the topic. And it's interesting to me that what you eat is what you are physically really hasn't changed. Research continues to bear that out. And so I know it may seem oversimplified, but thinking about what are we putting on our plate and what are we putting into our bodies is another very just basic, practical way that we can care for ourselves.
And what about getting enough sleep? Right? It's hard to sleep when you're grieving. It is. And think about when you wake up in the middle of the night, what do you do to help yourself? And some people will have a book by their bedside that might be on grief and might be something that can help them. Some people will write, spend some time writing. Others will pick up their phone and maybe, scroll on social media. Just be careful. If you pick up your phone in the middle of the night, you're more likely to probably stay awake. So think about when you wake up in the middle of the night, what are the things you can do to go back to sleep that will help you with that? But getting enough sleep is really important and especially challenging when you're grieving.
Right. By finding those things that aren't overly stimulating is really one of the things that can work. And I know that a lot of people, and I had this situation in my life the times when I've been, more intensely grieving over a death, is when I do wake up, that's what I'm thinking about. And it's hard. And I feel this weight. We described this in our last call. This weight is constantly on my chest. And so if I'm awake, it's hard to really focus and get to sleep. Some people have found that it's just, how can I take this that's in here and put it somewhere just for the moment so that I can get some rest? Because it's going to be there when you wake up the next morning. You might as well try to find a way to put it somewhere. Some people have found keeping a little notebook beside their bed and just writing down what it is they're thinking. What am I feeling at this moment? What does that, and getting it from in here out here can be helpful for people as well, finding ways to do that. If you're not a writer, I had a dad who very creatively, he would keep his phone by the bed and he wouldn't look at his phone when he get to sleep. He would hit the record button and he would record himself talking about what it is that's keeping him from sleeping, the memory, the whatever it was. And it was just a way to kind of get it from the inside out. So there are some strategies. You know yourself best, you know, what works for you. Implementing those strategies. Grief is hard and it's exhausting. We talked about this. It's physically exhausting. Yeah. So it's not being lazy by not doing these things. I get it. We're drained. But if we can find a little bit of energy to do some of these strategies so that we can try to get some sleep. Sleep is very important, just as important really as our nutrition.
And Andy, we're coming to the end of this particular video, but I do want to stress the importance of baby steps. So, you know, maybe something that we said has connected with you or resonated with you. It doesn't mean that we're expecting you to take everything and implement it tomorrow. Absolutely not. In fact, we're really talking about the importance of just taking a step forward in caring for yourself and taking a step forward in helping yourself so that you can help your family.
Yeah. Making yourself a priority.
Yes.
So that you can care for yourself. Be important. And so we hope that you've gotten something from this discussion on taking care of yourself. We will be back with you in our next discussion in our series Living with Grief in Uncertain Times, Help and Support for Families. The next time we will be talking about how to help your children. And of course, this was the first step, is creating some personal strategy for caring for yourself and making that space and taking that time for that to be available. So we'll look forward to our discussion next time on helping your children. Thank you for listening in.